I yawned as I awoke from the sunlight that streamed through my room's small window. That same window is what woke me up every morning if it wasn't cloudy, which helped me when I didn't awaken on time. Sadly, this very same window only gave me a view of the side street of the inn I resided and the tiled roof of the building across from the inn. This was part of the reason why the rent for this room is so much lower than the others. Throwing off the blanket covering me, I sat up from my bed and stretched. It had been difficult to sleep last night since I couldn't help but feel nervous at the prospect of being taught by Kasia today. The thoughts had even bothered me yesterday during the simple monster hunting job outside the walls of E. Rantel. What would she be teaching me today? Would I be able to meet Kasia's expectations, or would I only disappoint her? I did my best to avoid thinking about Kasia ending my training because I wasn't powerful enough. Even with my talent of magical aptitude, I couldn't help but wonder if without it, would I even be able to get to the level I am now, or would I just be a disappointing failure? It didn't help that whenever I was complimented about my magic ability, it was always compared with my innate talent. Being propped up by my talent would certainly never fade away, but I could at least try to make my skills stand out higher than my innate one. Looking down at the shirt I had worn yesterday and slept in, it looked like it needed a good washing, smelled like it too. It was at times like these that I wished I knew the clean spell so that I didn't have to borrow the wash basin from the innkeeper. She was kind enough to let me use it without cost. I assumed that my age had something to do with it. My age also made it increasingly difficult to hide my true gender from everyone, as it was becoming more painful to bind my breasts while my face is losing the androgynous looks from before and becoming more feminine. It was even worse when I had to hide my monthly bleeding from the others without it being noticeable. I didn't always hide my gender like this. It wasn't until 2 years ago, when my sister was taken by a noble, that I started hiding myself. I still picture the day it happened. Horses ridden by soldiers charged into our village, and they started to collect all girls above their 10th name day on the excuse that the Baron wishes to help educate young girls into proper ladies. It was a pitiful excuse, and yet, none outside of our village would question it. Before my sister, Tyr, was taken by the soldiers, she took me into our home and used her knife to chop off my long hair to look more boyish. After that, she quickly fitted me into some of our father's old clothing before hiding me away with her knife. I can still remember the noises of the soldiers kicking down our door and taking my sister while she screamed and fought. I stayed in that hiding place for an entire day before leaving it to find that the whole village had been ransacked. Anyone that had put up any resistance had been beaten until their faces were barely recognizable or were killed. Many that received those beatings had died soon afterwards, since we lacked access to any healers. Tyr and I are the only family we have left, and when she was taken, I packed anything that I would need to travel before I left the village in search of her, as well as to become practiced in my growing magic talents so that I could eventually rescue Tyr from wherever she might be. Even after 2 years of searching, I still didn't feel closer to finding Tyr than when I started. When I traveled to the Baron's castle under the guise of a job, I didn't find Tyr or any of the girls that were taken that day. Neither did I attempt to question or exact vengeance on the Baron, since I was too weak. I still think that I'm too weak to go back and meet that Baron. Perhaps that might change with Kasia teaching me. Yet, the Baron, Baldric, was only a single member in the group of corrupt nobles serving the 8 Fingers. It had taken a while, but I eventually dug around enough to learn about 8 Fingers. They are a criminal empire that have roots in multiple illegal activities in the Re-Estais kingdom. One of the largest businesses was slave trade until Princess Renna made the activity illegal. When I finally rescued my sister from wherever she might be, I think that I will try and do what I can to break up the slave trade. There is enough evil in the world without groups like the 8 Fingers making it worse. This idea is still just a pipe dream at this point. I need to become more powerful first before I can attempt any of my goals. Standing up from my bed, I walked over to where I set my pants and put them on. Next was the horrible chest bindings, followed by my shirt and boots. After that, I slung my satchel over my shoulder and pulled my cloak over that. I still had no conceivable idea about how Kasha could also tell I was female because of my body's movements. My cloak was meant to obscure how I walked, so something about my cloak must be giving away my gender. Either that or I still couldn't master hiding the movements of my hips. Reaching into my satchel, I pulled out a dried strip of beef and started eating it to satiate my hunger. I'd need to head to the market sometime later as I was running short on supplies. I had only 4 strips of beef and a small amount of hardened cheese as my rations. The cheese was quite awful, but it at least deterred me from eating it unless I had no other option. Picking up my staff that I left leaning in the corner of my room, I made one last check of all my supplies and gear to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. Staff, rations, coin pouch, adventurer knife, and my sister's knife. Everything was where it should be, so I finally opened the door of my room and left for the Adventurers Guild. Since it was early morning, a few of the other patrons were also leaving around the same time I was for whatever tasks they needed to accomplish. Some were fellow guild members that were heading the same way that I was, while others were more suspicious. One of the quieter tenants of the inn, Mars, was always quiet and left each day as quickly as he could, coming back later in the night without a sound. The innkeeper, Cherise, never had a complaint about the man as he always paid his rent on time and without missing a single copper missing. I personally think that the man is involved in some type of illegal business, but I lack any proof to fully believe this. I think that every inn has some tenants that are stranger than normal. I just happen to have chronic encounters with our inn's oddball in the mornings. Aside from Mars, there is also Celine, who is a prostitute. Profession aside, she isn't hard to talk to and is quite personable when you get to know her. I would have talks with her when we met each other, yet she wasn't up this morning. That is a bit odd. Perhaps she had a long night and is just sleeping a bit longer today. Continuing my normal morning routine, I exited the inn and began walking the streets with multiple things on my mind. Yesterday, Peter had said that he'd picked up a job that we'd be doing with Kasha today. It's supposed to be clearing a growing horde of undead in the graveyard. For some unusual reason, there had been a lot of jobs commissioned by the city guard to take care of the undead prowling the graveyard. Where once, we'd get requests for this job every 2 weeks, now we are getting requests almost every day. At this point, a lot of adventurers were getting sick of these jobs as the last small party who had entered the graveyard hadn't left. Since then, the copper plate rating of the jobs in the graveyard had risen to a silver plate rating. With the rise of job classification, that meant that the job's pay should have increased. Unfortunately, the guards were too cheap to increase the pay to a proper silver plate amount, so it had only been raised to 50 copper pieces instead of to silver coins. That pitiful amount of pay for more dangerous work didn't attract as many silver plate adventurers as it might have. The reason that Peter was getting us to take this job for a slight raise in pay of 60 copper pieces was due to an agreement that Peter had made with the guards. If we did this job for that small amount of pay, they'd also owe us a favor that we could cash in later. Having a favor from the guards would be useful if we ever got in trouble or needed their help for some reason. Very valuable depending on the circumstances for calling that favor in. I wasn't that worried about this job since Kasha would be joining us for it. With how powerful she is, there wasn't a monster that could harm her before being destroyed by her magic. That also made me a little excited, as I always became giddy like a young child when I saw such high-level displays of magic. Hopefully Kasha could perform another spell that I haven't seen yet. That spell she performed the other day to refill any mana I expended was something I'd only heard a few members of the Mages Guild talk about, and it was normally in a negative tone. The problem with that spell is that while it allowed one caster to augment and refill the mana of another's, it sucked up so much mana from the caster that it wasn't a viable spell to learn. And yet, Kasha didn't show any sign of her mana depleting when she used it in tandem with all the other spells she casted. It made me wonder how much mana Kasha must have compared to an average person. These thoughts continued to plague me as I walked through the market district and bought some rations to refill my lowered stock. I always made sure to have enough rations for any situation since I started traveling and working. I've heard too many tales of travelers dying on the road due to running out of food, and I lacked the hunting and foraging skills that someone like Dine had to survive in the wild. After buying food, I quickened my pace to the guild to arrive on time. If this was like any normal morning, the others would be sitting at one of the tables upstairs waiting for everyone to arrive. Peter would usually be going over a battle plan for any potential encounter, while Dine would assist by pointing out potential flaws in his plans. Lucrute would typically pick a seat by the balcony upstairs to watch people downstairs. Unfortunately, by Lucrute's standards, that meant that he'd be ogling any attractive member of the female gender that managed to catch his eye. Though, this had lessened somewhat since he met Kasha. His eyes were usually glued on her these days, a lot of male members of the guild were. Yet yesterday, when Kasha had been working on some personal errands, Lucrute had been in a depressed mood. Even his normal ogling was less enthusiastic than usual. In a short span of time, I finally arrived at the entrance of the guild and entered it. Inside, the building was buzzing with activity as adventurers were entering and exiting the doors repeatedly while a few lines were building up at the desks of the guild secretaries in order to take on jobs. The activity happening now was a typical sight to see in the morning. It would slow down in an hour or so due to a lot of members taking jobs early in the morning while expecting to be finished in the late afternoon or near dusk. Some members, typically known as carrier pigeons, received this nickname due to their tendency for taking jobs nearby the guild, completing them in an hour or two, and then coming back to the guild for another mission afterwards. Most carrier pigeons were newer members who needed the money or wanted to rank up quickly. They weren't as hated as the job poachers who sat at the benches downstairs and waiting for an easy and high-paying job to appear before quickly snatching it. There was unspoken guild etiquette that found it rude to wait for a job instead of just picking from what's available. Even now, one of the more hated job poachers, Cassius Carth, was sitting at a bench and waiting for a job to appear on the board. Cassius showed all the signs of a job poacher. His armor, well made and expensive, hardly had any scratches on it that one would typically expect from a rich adventurer like that. He had a well-groomed face that lacked any stubble and his dark hair had been groomed and cut by a professional. My first encounter with that man had been early in my career when I had grabbed a simple job that paid well. While in the line, Cassius had made the effort to bump into me to distract me as he switched my job flyer with another. I didn't even notice until I made it to the front desk and gave the secretary the job flyer, which was completely different from what I had earlier. I was not the first victim of that stunt of his, and I doubt that I'd be the last. It didn't help that Cassius was a gold-plate adventurer, which gave him a wider range of jobs to snatch. He'd probably get his just reward one day when he pulled that stunt on the wrong adventurer. After all, not everyone in the guild is a moral person. There are quite a few criminals within our ranks that people didn't want to mess with. "Hello, my cute little student. Miss me?" I couldn't help but jump at hearing the voice and feeling a pair of hands on my shoulders. Looking over my shoulder, I saw the grinning face of Kasha as my heart tried to slow down. "Did you really have to spook me like that, Kasha? And, when did you even get here?" "Just after you did. Surprised that you didn't notice me. Guess you were really deep in thought when you walked here. How in the world did someone like Kasha not get noticed?" Everything about her screamed attention-grabbing. That question would have to be answered another day, and hopefully Kasha would actually answer it. "Right," I replied, unconvinced. "Shall we go upstairs to meet with the others? They're waiting for us." Kasha nodded and the two of us started walking towards the stairs. "By the way, did you accomplish whatever it was that you were trying to do yesterday?" "I certainly did. And, before you ask, no, I'll possibly tell you what I was doing at a later date." Was she reading my mind? Because her answer was frighteningly accurate to what I wanted to ask her. "Anything interesting happen with you and the others?" "Not much, just a boring monster-slaying job. We should be getting a silver plate job in the Rantel graveyards to clear out the undead." Kasha looked at me with a raised eyebrow. "That's strange. I took on one of those jobs a few days ago. How come there are still a lot of undead running around after I cleared them out?" Are the guards just too lazy to do their jobs? So, she also pulled a graveyard shift. I could imagine the destruction she caused when she accomplished that job, which makes me wonder how there is still a chronic slew of undead striding about the graveyard. While the guards can be lazy, the reason that the ones guarding the graveyard hire adventurers to deal with the undead is because they are meant to be ready to fight for the city at a moment's notice, while us adventurers normally take a neutral stance in political actions of the countries. If the city were to be attacked by the slain or Baharuth, the guards would need to be ready instead of the adventurers. So, they hire the job to adventurers in order to lessen the risk of getting injured. Kasia didn't get to question me further as the two of us were called over by Peter. "Come on, you two. We've been waiting for you to show up." I couldn't help but smile at the blonde's invitation. It was strange how Peter could always make me feel positive about my day. I guess his natural charisma helped in that matter. Actually, it was pretty amusing how Peter could unintentionally steal the hearts of a few of the girls he encountered. He could be so oblivious at times that he wouldn't even notice how his presence caused girls to react. "Good morning, everyone." I returned to my team as Kasia and I hurried over to their table. "Hello, boys," Kasia said in that breathy tone of hers. "Mind informing the two of us on what's happening at the graveyard?" The two of us quickly took our seats at the table and got a better view of a map of Rantle that was splayed out on the table. Nina informed you about what we're doing today. That's good, though I need to inform you about the rest of the job that I didn't tell the rest of you yet. I wanted your opinions first before we did it." "What opinions?" Lucrute and I asked together. "There is a side objective to our job which involves a rescue mission. Since yesterday, a group of adventurers called Dragon Furnace went missing in the graveyard. They were supposed to clear out undead up to the Hangman's Tree about 150 yards from the entrance gate. While it's not an actual objective in the job at hand, I was asked to try search for them as a personal favor to a friend. What do you think? This must be serious if someone was personally asking Peter for help. Even with my doubts that Dragon Furnace was still alive in that graveyard, I couldn't ignore that there might be a chance to save them or, at the very least, bring back their bodies for their loved ones. "I'm fine with this side objective," I answered quickly. "I also agree with Nina. If we can save Dragon Furnace, then we should." Dine answered with that altruistic side of his. If there was one personality trait that anyone could think of when talking about Dine, is the unerring kindness that he showed everyone. Even with him being a silverplate adventurer, there were quite a few gold-plate groups that would love to recruit our druid due to his reliability and personality. To be honest, I always felt that Dine might be much stronger than he let on, at least low-leveled gold-plate if I underestimated it. His connection with nature is quite strong, and I always felt that he could use his druidic magic with greater intensity than he displayed normally. Perhaps he held himself back because he preferred our team compared to a gold-plated group. With Kasia joining us, and the immense amounts of power that she barely reined in, it might get Dine to display more of his real strength, since Kasia didn't tend to hold back. Even those spells that she casted the other day, while lower-leveled, were charged with an intense amount of mana behind them. She only held back from wiping out all the ogres and goblins at once since she wanted to see what we could do. What would the Swords of Darkness be if they didn't have their trusty archer by their side? Lucrute stated with a grin as he propped his feet up onto the table and leaned back into his chair. With everyone accepting the side mission, there was only one person left who hadn't answered yet. "I don't doubt your skills, Lucky, but I'm going to accept since someone has to make sure that all of you make it out of this job in one piece." And, much to my surprise, Kasia wrapped her arm around my shoulders and pulled me close to her. "I have to make sure that my little student is able to train with me today." I couldn't help but blush at how doting Kasia was acting right now. Peter laughed, whether at my current predicament or just from pure joy, before he spoke. "Excellent. Thank you all for agreeing with his side objective. We should start heading to the cemetery now while the sun is shining down on us, and hopefully take care of the undead and find Dragon Furnace before the daylight is hidden behind the walls." After saying this, Peter got out of his chair, which signaled for the rest of us to do the same. Peter wasn't wrong in wishing to get this task done quickly while we still had daylight. The undead in the cemetery tended to become stronger in darker areas, and the tall walls surrounding the cemetery tended to block the sunlight after the noon sun passed. It didn't help that the cemetery tended to be foggy for some reason which obscured any undead reaching out from their graves or lying on the ground in wait. The Mages Guild theorized that this perpetual fog was a side effect of whatever magical phenomenon caused the undead to rise. That created more questions than answers, which bothered the naturally curious side of myself. Why might fog arise due to undeath? A question that still lacked any answer. As the five of us stood together, I thought about why the undead in the cemetery were appearing in greater numbers than before. Some of the more religious citizens of Rantel claimed that it was a sign of displeasure from the gods of their displeasure about our continuous war with the Baharuth. I highly doubted that if the gods were displeased, they'd only raise some undead instead of performing more noticeable signs. I'd be more believing of the gods' displeasure if lightning rained down from the sky and started smiting people. Actually, when I talked to Dine the other day, he noted that it felt like the life force of the plants and animals of the city was slowly being drained. If there was any logical answer for why the undead were appearing more often, then I'd hazard a guess that it'd be due to what was happening to the life force of the city. Pop quiz, kiddo, Kasha stated, which pulled me from my thoughts. Pop quiz? What's that? I'd never heard that term used before. It sounded strange. It's just a name for a quick and unexpected test that is short. Now, enough about asking me questions, since I'm the one that's meant to be asking all the questions. Ready? While I did wish to ask what she was planning, I remained quiet due to her command. She must be trying to learn about what knowledge I already knew. Ready? I answered with determination. What types of magic and attacks are undead weak against? Bludgeoning attacks along with fire and holy magic are their major weaknesses. I answered confidently. Good answer, though you did miss that they have a weakness to attacks attuned to the good alignment. I groaned at how I missed that weakness. The good alignment attacks were rarer to see than the other three. Chin up, kiddo. You can't always be right, and failures are meant to inspire you to remember that knowledge for later. I'll try and keep that in mind. I answered with a nod. Here's another question. What types of attacks are undead immune to? While that question was slightly harder, I quickly tried to recall everything I learned about undead up to now. They can't be affected by mind-altering attacks, sleep effects, poisons, and disease. Those are all that come to mind right now. Very good. Just remember to add that they have immunities to energy-draining attacks and a biological need to breathe. I've seen adventurers that didn't learn about an undead's weaknesses beforehand and popped off spells that worked against average monsters like goblins or orcs. They quickly got their ass handed to them along with their pride. The utter amusement in Kasha's voice as she said this told me that what she saw was likely very funny. What happened to the adventurers afterwards? I decided to help after watching them run about like a headless chicken. Both their group and I had been exploring the same dungeon, and I felt a little grateful to the team for going ahead and setting off all the traps so that I didn't accidentally trigger them. Wasn't the last time I encountered them, but that's a story for another day, she said, ending the tale of hers. From all the weaknesses we've discussed about the undead, what spells do you know that can capitalize on them? I can cast Firebolt, Flame Wave, Magic Missile, and Force Blast. I don't have any spells that can utilize the holy or good element, which prevents me from using those damage types. I answered in slight nervousness as I hoped that my spell list wouldn't disappoint her. Quite respectable. You have the fire and potential bludgeoning damage depending on how you utilize your spells, though I recommend that you pick up at least one spell of the holy or good element if able, since you never know if an undead has some item or trait that negates fire and bludgeoning damage. From my experience, fire resistance is more popular to use than others. As an archer, it can get annoying dealing with undead at times. Lucrute spoke up next to us. The blonde pulled out an arrow from his quiver to show the arrow's sharp tip. Depending on the undead, these arrows can fly through their bodies without even damaging anything. He stuck the arrow back into his quiver before reaching inside once more and pulling out a new arrow with a tip that was much broader than the previous one. More like a bulb with a point than an arrowhead. It's why I started making these arrows. While they create more air resistance than my other arrows, these bullhead arrows slam into undead like a club. Lucrute bragged with a grin. How many of those arrows do you have stored on you? Kasha asked with interest. 15. The downside of these arrows is that they take up more space than normal arrows. My arrow count in total would be 35. No doubt, those arrows also weighed Lucrute down more than his usual arrows due to the greater amount of metal making up the tips. Kasha put a finger under her chin in thought after hearing Lucrute's answer. Seems that your skills as an archer are being held back by how much you can carry. I might have a solution to that problem, but you'd need to give me a few days or so to get it ready. That grabbed Lucrute's attention and caused the archer to sidle up next to Kasha. Oh, a solution? I'd love to hear what your idea might be, the blonde asked excitedly. Kasha simply tapped her fingers against Lucrute's forehead and caused the blonde to be slightly pushed back. Patience is a virtue. It's rude to rush a woman, after all. She playfully patted Lucrute's cheek before picking up her pace and laughing. The pair of us looked at each other, and I couldn't tell if his face was turning red due to Kasha's patting or because he was blushing. That torch that Lucrute was carrying for Kasha was unlikely to go out anytime soon. Hopefully, Kasha didn't end up breaking his heart. I highly doubt that Celica's restaurant had enough alcohol stocked to handle a depressed Lucrute. Celica had certainly seen Lucrute drink himself to unconsciousness due to a bad breakup. Part of the problem was that the romantic archer tended to chase women that were beautiful but were horrible human beings. Kasha didn't seem like that. She acted quite kind, though I haven't spent enough time around her to confirm if that was an act or not. One thing for certain, I believe that Kasha has a bit of a sadistic streak from the way that she acted when talking about my training. Nina, you think I've got a chance with her? Lucrute asked me. I gave him a glance before patting him on the back. No idea. I wish you luck on your quest since it appears that you're going to need it. I believe that the best course of action when dealing with a lovesick man and a woman who could easily kill him is to stay back and watch it play out. I've seen Lucrute's attempts at romance and have learned since then to stay back and let him figure it out on his own. The rest of the journey to the cemetery wasn't anything to write home about. It was quite dull, and yet, I could see Kasha discussing something with Peter in depth. I could only assume that it might be plans for the job which I didn't wish to interrupt just in case it might be something important. It wasn't until we arrived at the front gate of the cemetery that anything of interest could be noted. Up ahead, a pair of guards could be seen standing in front of the gate, while atop the walls connected to the gate were multiple other guards that were focused on something within the cemetery. When we approached the gate, the two guards began looking us over with bored interest until their eyes landed on Kasha. The moment they saw her, their eyes grew wide with shock and fear. What could Kasha have possibly done to make these guys afraid of her? Oh shit, the woman is back. I heard the bearded guard loudly whisper to his partner. Both quickly stopped slouching and stood straight like arrows. Hello, boys, remember me? Kasha loudly asked as we approached the pair. Why yeah. Do you need anything? Should we open the gate and get out of your way? The bearded guard quickly stammered. The reaction of the guard wasn't noticed by only me, as the others gave the blonde questioning looks. Kasha, how do you know these guys? Peter asked with interest. My first day here, I took a job to clear out some undead in the cemetery. Unfortunately, Kasha emphasized while glancing at the terrified guards, these two doubted my ability to handle myself. I proved them wrong when I turned the undead, the cemetery, and the headstones into a molten crater. Upon saying this, she snapped her fingers and allowed a small ball of fire to burst alight in her hand. Oh, Peter said in surprise, not that I could blame him. Even with my knowledge that Kasha was probably the strongest mage that I've encountered, it still seemed hard to believe that someone could have so much power without seeing proof of it. Regardless of the party's thoughts on what we just learned, Peter fell back into his calm demeanor to keep the rest of us focused. Mind letting us through? With a group called the Swords of Darkness that were hired to help clear out the cemetery. Right away. The bearded guard answered quickly. Then, he and his partner walked up to the gate and removed the heavy wooden plank that was barring the gate. Normally, I would assume that it might take more than 2 men to lift the plank barring the door, but the 2 guards seemed empowered to remove the plank as quickly as possible to get us on our way. After pulling one of the doors of the gate open, the bearded one said, "You can proceed now. Good luck." Then he and his partner hugged their backs to the wall and waited. Kasha and Peter were the first to step through the gate, and I believe that the sorceress winked at the 2 guards as she passed them. The rest of us quickly followed after them and arrived on the other side of the gate. We finally were able to witness what Kasha was talking about, we looking less than 40 meters ahead of us. The ground was completely blackened and dead around a crater within a radius of 10 meters. The remains of gravestones could be spotted surrounding this crater and were mostly melted. What kind of heat would be required to melt stone? I was pulled out of my thoughts when the gate behind us slammed shut. I glanced over my shoulder and narrowed my eyes at the cowardly guards. It was moments like these that made it hard for adventurers to respect city guards of any main city. Typically, guards posted at cities were weaker and more cowardly than those posted on the roads or those drafted for the unending wars with Baharuth. The reason that these cities had lower quality guards was due to said guards either being really lucky in getting posted here or they bribed their way to a cushy job away from any real conflict. The problem got worse the closer you were to the kingdom's capital, as the bribery was more overt and the influence of the criminal organization known as Eight Fingers got stronger. It was one of the reasons that Rantel was more tolerable than most cities in the kingdom, as it was the only city standing between us and the blood-soaked Katza Plains. Those guys were in a hurry. Lucrute noted to the rest of us as he unslung his bow from his shoulder and nocked an arrow in preparation. "Maybe we should try to do the same." "I agree," Dine stated as he pulled out his mace. "Something feels wrong with this cemetery. Something unnatural." I couldn't stop the chills that ran down my spine when Dine said this. Normally, the druid was completely calm and unflappable, yet the tense demeanor that he emitted put me on edge. "At the very least, I can spot Hangman's tree up ahead. Shouldn't take us that long to get there," Peter said while drawing his sword. "Even better, the undead are coming to us. We'll probably clear out enough undead by the time we get to said tree," Kasha added. Up ahead, I could see the standard undead moving towards us while more were digging themselves out of the ground to join the growing horde. "I don't think that I brought enough arrows for this," Lucrute said as he loosed an arrow at the horde ahead of us, easily scoring a headshot that downed the monster. This seemed to cause the horde to charge towards us as one. Lucrute began firing his arrows repeatedly while I joined the ranged fighting by evoking firebolts at the charging undead. We were eventually joined by Kasha, who strangely shot spears of ice at the undead. Even stranger was the way that the undead reacted when pierced by these ice spears. The moment a spear touched or pierced them, they would stop moving while bright white light shot out of their orifices like geysers. Then they would collapse and stop moving. "Kasha, what type of ice spell causes undead to react like that?" I asked while continuing to fire attacks at the slowly shrinking horde. "It's not due to it being an ice spell. It's enhanced with holy magic." She then stopped firing ice spears at the horde and patted Peter and Dine on their shoulders. The moment she did so, both were shrouded by white auras that faded to barely visible levels. "You two are buffed. Go kick some ass." The sorceress then pushed the fighters forwards with an encouraging pat on their backs. With that accomplished, the 2 fighters charged forwards and eventually met the undead horde midway between us. Under normal circumstances, anyone would assume that those 2 would be swallowed up by that horde and quickly killed. Instead, the moment the first skeleton scraped its hand against Dine, a blast of bright light emitted from Dine and launched the skeleton, and any undead near it, backwards. Upon seeing the effects of Kasha's spell, Peter and Dine seemed to become invigorated with new strength. This could be seen as the pair started cutting the undead down like a pair of holy paladins. I couldn't help but chuckle at how giddy the pair seemed in the midst of an undead horde. Really happy that we have Kasha with us now. This job would have been awful without those spells of hers, Lucrute stated as he fired another arrow at a zombie that seemed more interested in us than Peter and Dine. Is it normal for this many undead to be prowling about? It wasn't as crowded when I was last here. Kasha asked while picking off any undead that tried to approach our fighters while they were occupied. Not really. Largest wave I've seen yet. I answered. And it was true, I've never seen this many undead grouped up in the cemetery like they were now. Reminded me more of the tales that some soldiers told us in the guild about the Katsa Plains. Most battles out there became a three-way battle between Riastais, Baharuth, and the undead that prowled the plains. From what I heard, it's been becoming such a problem that both nations tended to enter an unofficial truce to clear undead from the battlefield before starting their next battle. Yet, it was an effort in futility since the undead that they destroyed would quickly be replaced by the casualties of their latest battle. Then I'll try to give you all some breathing room. When Kasha said this, she stopped firing ice spears at the horde and held her hand out, which caused a magic circle to spiral out from her palm. Instantly upon doing this, the ground, under a section of the undead horde behind the section that Peter and Dine were fighting, grew stony teeth before growing into a massive pair of jaws that snapped up a massive section of the horde and quickly crushed them with a few chomps. Then, the stony jaws sunk into the ground with their hapless victims in tow. The rest of the skirmish was quickly taken care of as Peter and Dine eradicated the remaining horde. When the last zombie was put down with a slam of Dine's mace, Lucrute and I looked at Kasha with shocked expressions at what just transpired. Kasha, why didn't you just lead with that? Lucrute asked. I wanted to give you all a chance to feel good about yourselves. That changed when I felt a little worried that the horde might be too much for all of you to handle. Kasha answered as she took off her spectacles and quickly cleaned them before putting them back on. Makes me feel a little sad that you didn't believe that we could take care of ourselves, Lucrute said with disappointment. Sorry about that. I'm still not completely used to fighting with others, and I became quite worried that you guys could get hurt. I'll try to be less coddling if that's what you want. Kasha apologized with a smile. The way she was acting seemed more like a mother than a teammate. In a way, it seemed quite funny to be honest. Eventually, Peter and Dine joined up with us and were still grinning like a pair of loons. I think that spell of Kasha's did more than just protect the pair of them, either that or they were still filled with a rush from the battle. That was one of the more excitable jobs in the cemetery that we've taken. What was that spell that swallowed up all those undead? Peter asked as he rested his sword on his pauldron. It's called Jaws of the Earth Dragon. The spell can swallow up a large group of enemies and pull them underground to be crushed if they don't escape quickly enough. Kasha answered while resting her hands on her hips. I think it's appropriate that the dead were returned back to where they belong. I'll be honest, if I ever got to learn a high-tier spell, that would be one of the first that I'd choose. It looked amazing in practice, and it would be so useful when fighting larger groups of enemies. Even with how long I've been using magic, it still amazed me with the way that I could become completely enamored with seeing powerful spells being cast. It was like I was a young child, again, watching a traveling mage performing tricks for the village children. Even so, more might rise up, and I'd rather not have our investigation get interrupted by more hordes. Ready to move? Peter remarked to the rest of us while scanning the area for more enemies. I'm in agreement. I don't like being around dead bodies at the best of times, especially when those bodies are trying to tear my throat out. Lucrute added. That was also the moment that I noticed that Lucrute's quiver was running dangerously short of arrows. We should hurry then. The tree is just up ahead, I stated to the others. We quickly marched forwards after this, with Peter and Dine taking the lead and chopping down any zombie or skeleton that attempted to crawl from the ground ahead of us. At the same time, Kasha remained at the back of the party and incinerated any undead that tried to attack us from behind or at the sides. Lucrute and I remained in the middle and slayed any undead coming from the sides. I'm guessing the only reason the two of us got to take down any undead was because Kasha let them come towards us. Probably to let us feel like we were actually helping the party instead of being useless. It wasn't long before we finally reached the appropriately named Hangman's Tree. From what history I remember of Rantel, before the cemetery grew as large and infested with undead as it is now, executions were performed here. Criminals would be taken to these trees and hung until death. Following this, their bodies would be dumped into a shallow grave and forgotten. The two theories that have become widely accepted is that due to the strong emotions from those that were executed, as well as the treatment and desecration of their bodies, it caused either the souls of the spiteful dead to vengefully hunt those who refused them a proper burial, or that the gods themselves, seeing such horrific actions of the mortals, to curse this land and never allow the dead to rest as long as the bodies of the desecrated were refused a proper burial. I tended to believe the first theory before the second. From what I've read, undead tended to rise where great bloodshed or conflict occurred. And based on Rantel's history of executing criminals here, that fulfilled the bloodshed requirement. Even now, as we approached the tree, I could spot the rotten and molded remnants of nooses that were still tied to the branches of the tree. I couldn't help but wonder how many had been sentenced to die by those ropes. Even worse was the thought of how many of the criminals hung on those ropes might have been innocent. Guys, look around the tree for clues, but stay on guard for any more undead. Peter ordered. We didn't say much as we began walking around the tree and looked for any clues that the members of Dragon Furnace might have been here. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for me to spot something of interest. When I had circled to the back of the tree, I spotted something that stood out within this cemetery. On one of the roots of the tree that grew from the ground, I spotted a forearm that held onto the root in an unbreaking grip. While the limb of a dead body wasn't that odd to be strewn about the cemetery, what was odd was the condition of the limb. Brown cloth of a torn shirt still remained tucked into a well-maintained gauntlet with a strange symbol carved into the top of the gauntlet. The location of where the limb had been torn off was covered in dried blood, with some of this dried blood having long since dripped onto the ground. Guys, I think I found something of interest. I called out to the others. Quickly enough, the group arrived to where I stood and looked down at the unattached limb. Kasha was the first to approach the limb, where she slowly kneeled down and took an audible sniff near the limb. When she finished, Kasha spoke over her shoulder to us. The limb is recent and lacks any form of rotting smell that undead usually exude. Blood also still smells relatively recent, even if it has already coagulated. Disturbingly, Kasha then gripped the forearm by the wrist and ripped it off the root of the tree with the audible sound of the bones in the fingers breaking. She then walked over to Peter with the limb in hand before holding it out to him. The armor on this arm has an unusual symbol on it. Do you recognize it? When Peter investigated the limb, his eyes quickly sparked with recognition before he looked back at Kasha. That's the symbol for Dragon Furnace. Most of their armor was made by one of their members. He was known for etching his symbol into each piece that he worked on. Slowly, Peter took the limb from Kasha and pulled out a small burlap sack from his bag that he stored the limb inside. Celine is going to be upset when she sees this. The blonde muttered to himself, Kasha, would your sense of smell be able to follow the smell of this limb? I'm unable to track the owner of that limb by smell from a far distance right now. The combination of this graveyard and the stench of the city hinders me in that regard, but, she then pointed towards a muddied area further past the tree. The scent of that arm, as well as anyone else, disappears at that spot. Almost like they were dragged underground. Peter glanced at the muddied area before waving at us to follow him. He didn't say anything, but I already assumed that we might be digging up that section of the cemetery. Upon arriving at the mud, Kasha waved her hand, which caused a magic circle to flash before her. Moments later, the dirt before us began churning until it started to act like a liquid, while anything in the dirt started floating to the surface like logs of wood. While there were skeletons and older, rotten bodies that floated to the surface, I quickly spotted a group of 4 bodies that looked relatively new in comparison. All of them were covered in mud, yet one of the corpses that wore mud-caked armor was missing their right arm. With another wave of her hand, the 4 bodies floated over to us before being deposited onto the ground in front of Peter. Peter quickly wiped mud off the armor of the corpses, eventually revealing the same symbol we found on the gauntlet also being etched into the other armors of the group. We had found the bodies of Dragon Furnace. Yet, I didn't understand why their bodies had been buried in the ground like they were. Undead didn't have any drive except to kill the living, so why had the members of Dragon Furnace been dumped into the ground? I don't understand. Why were all of them buried in the ground? Lucrute asked. Undead don't bury bodies. It's quite obvious, Kasha answered, there was an intelligence that wanted these 4 buried. It could have been a criminal that killed them with the hope that the undead would be blamed. But, the other option is that a necromancer commanded the undead to kill these 4 for some unknown reason. Either way, we should figure out what we want to do with the bodies and leave this place quickly. We don't know if whoever buried these 4 might still be watching us. We should take the bodies with us and leave them with the guards. I can contact my friend afterwards to verify them. Peter reasoned with a slow nod. If we're finally finished with this job, then can we get out of here? This place is really freaking me out. Lucrute asked. I was in agreement with his assessment. Especially since Kasha seemed uncharacteristically serious. It was a silent trek out of the cemetery as all of us continued to think about how the members of Dragon Furnace had been killed. It could have been an accident or it could have been intentional. It was very likely to be intentional from the evidence that we'd seen, and Kasha let the guards know this when we left the bodies with them. After this, the guards quickly paid us for our job and we headed back to the guild hall to register the job's completion with the guild. Oddly, even with everything that I'd seen, my excitement for my training after the job was barely marred. In fact, my urge for training was filled with resolve, as if I got stronger in my magic abilities, then I could be more likely to prevent such a tragedy from happening in the future. After we split the money up among us, Peter was the first to leave so that he could give his friend the news. Following this, Kasha and I left the guild hall for training. Kiddo, do you feel up to do training today? I'll understand if you need a bit of time to process everything that you've seen. Kasha asked me as we traversed through the city. I've seen much worse when my village was attacked. I answered. When the Baron sent his men to take the girls of my village, they didn't just take the girls. They killed many of the protesting villagers very horrifically. Some had their stomachs cut open to let their innards spill out. From what a few of the survivors said, a few had still been alive attempting to put their innards back into their bodies. My answer satisfied Kasha as she gave me a nod. Then, she asked me something surprising. Lucrute told me a bit about your past. Not everything, mind you, but enough to give me a basic idea about who you are. Would you be open to telling me a bit more about yourself, or would you like to wait? Ever since I left my village, I'd only told the rest of our team about everything that had happened to my village, the way that my sister was taken, how I'd spent years looking for my sister. In all of this time, it's been so rare to hear someone ask me about my past in the village. What did he tell you? I asked, quieter than expected. Only that you've had a harder life than most, and that your sister was taken by nobles. Would you be willing to share more? I was silent for a few moments as I processed this. Then, I spoke. I grew up in the village of Sunreed. It was named after the gold color of the reeds that populated the small lake near us. We were a simple people that mainly exported crops and fish. But since our village was small and away from major cities, we were ruled over by a lesser baron that tended to abuse his position due to how far away from his lords we were. But even with the greater tithes that we had to pay, the people of Sunreed eked out a living. Thinking about how my parents and sister would remain positive even during our harder times caused a smile to grace my lips. It wasn't all bad. At times, travelers would come by with things to entertain us with. There was a mage that came to our village once and performed spells for us. And, once a year, we would have a summer festival to celebrate another year of good harvest. There'd be a carrot cake that old Seville would cook for the village, which was the highlight of every year. I can still remember what Seville's cakes tasted like, and never have I been able to find anything close in taste to what Seville made. Sadly, the secret to her cakes died with her. Unfortunately, a few years ago, a sickness came to our village and took so many of us, even my parents weren't spared from the fever. And, since we were so far from any city, we couldn't get healers to the sick until it was too late. When the sickness had finally passed, about half of the village had died. That was the beginning of Sunreed's hardships. Since so many villagers died, our production had taken a nosedive and we couldn't keep up with the Baron's tithes. I learned later on that the Baron had a love for living a lavish lifestyle. Clothing, food, feasts, you name it. He was able to afford it because of the large tithes that he made us pay. Yet, when we couldn't produce as much as he demanded, that lavish lifestyle ate into his coffers. I think it's the reason that he sent his men to our village one day. They came to take the girls of our village that had reached their 10th name day or higher. My sister saw this and ran to where I had been playing. She didn't say anything as she took me inside our house and used her knife to chop my hair down. Then, she put me in some of our father's old clothing and hid me away with her knife. Soon after, the Baron's men arrived at our house and took her away. I don't know where she is, but I have been searching for her for the past 2 years. 2 years, and I still don't feel any closer. I finally finished my tale with a long intake of breath. Then, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Looking at the gloved hand, and then up to Kasha's eyes. I expected to see pity or anger within her orange eyes, instead, they contained a warmth to them that I hadn't seen directed at me in years. Nina, you don't have to look for your sister alone anymore. I'll help you. What? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Kasha stopped us from walking any further and turned me to face her. I promise you, right now, if you are willing to delay your training for a little longer, then I will find and bring your sister back to you alive by the end of this day. I felt my heart pumping hard at what Kasha just promised. I'd be able to see my sister. 2 years of searching would finally be over. Why you can be bring her back tea to me? My voice kept choking as I tried to speak. When I make a promise, I keep it. Would you like to see your sister today? I couldn't speak at this point, so I just nodded. Then, we'll go get your sister. I couldn't stop myself from wrapping Kasha in a hug and just repeating the words thank you over and over. She returned the gesture, and in a single moment, the world walked around us until the floor beneath us was no longer a cobblestone road and instead was made of wooden planks. When I broke away from the embrace, I noticed that we were both standing inside of a room of an inn. At least, I thought it was an inn since the distant noises of patrons could be heard from here. If you're wondering where we are, it's just my room in the Hero's Respite. Now, take a seat since I'll need your assistance for the spell that I'll be casting. I was quiet as I followed Kasha's instructions and sat down at the small table in her room. She then took a seat at the other side of the table. Now, I have a few methods to locate your sister. One of them would take time since I don't know where I should be looking, the other is unavailable since I don't have an item of your sister's to use, and the final method will take preparation to cast, Kasha stated. I quickly reached into my satchel and pulled out Tyre's dagger. That's Tyre's. I've held onto it for all of these years. Can you still use it for your spell? I quickly said. Kasha simply smirked before she reached over and picked up the dagger. Holding it gently, she inspected the object before looking back at me. This will do, Kasha said before setting the dagger back down onto the table. The spell that I'll be using locates the owners of an object. Since this was your sister's dagger before entering your possession, the spell can still find her. It just needs to be cast at a higher level. She held her hand above the dagger and spoke, locate owner. A white magic circle appeared above the dagger. Then, a glowing orb floated upwards from the dagger until it stopped at Kasha's eye level. Nina, no matter what you see or what might be happening to your sister, remain calm. After giving this warning, the orb began to dim and revealed the image of a bed with a naked woman laying upon it. The woman was unnaturally thin and looked like she hadn't bathed in some time. Her body was covered in so many bruises and cuts, especially on her lower body. It was horrific, especially since even with all the filth, the cuts, and the bruises, I knew this woman. I knew that blonde hair, those turquoise eyes, that face. It was Tyre. I tried to remain calm, yet I found the act to be increasingly difficult the more I examined all the abuse that my sister had taken. How much pain must she be in from all of those untreated wounds? Nina, we're going to teleport to your sister's location. I'll do what I can to get her into a moving condition, then I'll be sending Tyre and you back to my room. Understand? I tore my eyes away from Tyre and quickly nodded to Kasia. Then, she stood up from her chair, I followed in suit. A moment later, the entire room walked and we arrived at the foot of the bed that Tyre was on. The first thing I noticed upon arriving here was the stench. It smelled of old sex and sweat. Even through these walls, I could hear moans and screams of pain and pleasure. If the stench smelled terrible to me, I couldn't help but wonder how much worse it must be for Kasia. Regardless of what Kasia must be smelling, she still moved quickly to the side of the bed and whispered, "Healing of Freya." The moment that Kasia cast her spell on Tyre, I noticed an immediate difference. Her skin took on a redder hue as the bruises and cuts all over her body faded and healed until no sign of injury remained. Finally, the labored breathing of Tyre stopped while her chest rose and fell in a healthy cadence. "Nina, can you pick your sister up?" I took a place at the side of the bed and scooped Tyre up in my arms. What worried me was how light Tyre felt as I cradled her in my arms. "I'm going to send you back to my room. Stay there until I come back." I didn't get a chance to respond as I found myself back in the room of Hero's Respite. Quickly, I walked over to the lone bed in Kasia's room and set Tyre down before I pulled the bedsheets over her. I held Tyre's thin hand in my own, fully afraid that if I let her go, she might disappear on me again. Then, I cried tears of joy. I had my sister back. It was hard to keep calm in front of Nina after arriving here. If she knew everything occurring in this wretched place the way that I did, then no doubt she'd be thankful that her human senses obscured so much of the world from her mind. Even as I healed Tyre, I could hear young boys and girls crying in pain through the walls. I could hear some of the slaves of this place praying for freedom, death, or something in between. The stench of sickness, sex, death, and blood assailed my nostrils. It took all my will to hide my shaking rage from Nina, yet I managed to calmly tell her after healing Tyre, "Nina, can you pick your sister up?" If I hadn't healed the blonde girl before telling my student this, I doubt that some of her ribs and pelvis wouldn't break under the new pressure. There were many fractures in her bones that I needed to heal, and a lot of the fractures were gathered around her chest and pelvis. No doubt due to their rough use. Thankfully, Nina did so without questioning me. Then, I told her, "I'm going to send you back to my room. Stay there until I come back." I could see the ghost of a question grow on her lips, but I didn't give her a chance to speak as I teleported her back to Hero's Respite. She didn't need to see this. She wouldn't witness my wrath. It was when Nina was finally gone that I let my illusion that hid my true form finally fall down to reveal my non-human features. One of my first actions after doing this was to let my bristling tail smash the bed in front of me into pieces. I didn't care about how much noise I made right now, I just needed an immediate outlet for everything I felt. Even if one of these despicable monsters heard the noise I made and saw my true form, they wouldn't get the chance to tell anyone after I was done. Message. I announced as I felt the spell connect to the intended recipient. "Hey, boss. Is there a reason that you're calling me right now? I'm a bit busy trying to keep the fish you brought yesterday from dying due to a lack of any form of ecosystem in the lake you just made. Kinda didn't think that whole idea through, did? Not now. I am beyond angry right now and require you to answer me a question." I interrupted before my copy could go off into a tangent. There was a slight pause before my copy spoke in a more serious tone. "Boss, what happened and what do you need me to do?" I found myself in the den of a bunch of sex slavers. "Do we have any area to hold prisoners in? Do we have any available beds for injured?" Thankfully, There were some jail cells made in the guard towers, since I expected that we might eventually get some extremely enthusiastic citizens that needed a drunk tank for a night or two. There are also plenty of rooms and beds for more guests. I got finished making them for potential expansion. My copy answered, much to my relief. Good. I'm going to resummon you to where I am right now. I quickly cut the call after saying this, followed quickly by ending the replicant spell. Then, I cast the spell again and watched as my copy grew to life in front of me. Where she once may have had that sly grin on her face like usual, she instead had an uncharacteristic dour look. I thought that I'd seen a lot of shitty things in life, but what happened to Tyre took the fucking cake. What's your orders? I couldn't help but nod in agreement with my copy before answering her question. We're going to go full salting the earth in this hellhole. When I leave this room, you will seal all entrances and exits of this building. You will also cut off all forms of communication, magical or otherwise. All guilty parties will be dealt with by me. You will heal and take any innocents you find back to the settlement. I avoided using the word slave when referring to any of the people trapped in here. They were better than that, unlike the pieces of shit who perpetuated their suffering. With the plan in place, the two of us walked out of Tyre's former room and entered the hallway of this building. I couldn't help but smile as I heard footsteps quickly running to my location, no doubt attracted by the noises I made. Around the corner at the end of the hallway, I spotted a man running near me with muscles bigger than whatever brains he had. When he finally noticed me, he didn't get the chance to say a word as I flicked a tail at the man and impaled his head into the wall. Well, he had some brains once. Ripping my tail out of the man's head, I noted that there were 3 more doors leading off to other rooms in this hallway. The closest door to me, opposite the room I just exited, was the first room I started with. Using one of my tails, I broke the door off its hinges and let it fall to the ground. Inside the room, I spotted a man frozen in shock at my entrance. He was midway in pulling off his trousers, giving me more than enough time for my eyes to flick to a young woman tied to her bed. My anger increased as my eyes flicked back to the disrobing man. Time's up. I growled out as 3 of my tails darted over my head and struck the man in his chest, ruining the silken shirt he once wore. It was probably a noble that I just killed, not that I gave a shit. Free her, heal her, and get her to the settlement. Then come back when you're finished. I ordered as I left the room. My copy wordlessly obeyed my orders as I walked out of the room and made my way to the next. In the second room of the hallway, I broke down the door and stepped into the room. There, I spotted a young boy sitting on the bed in fetal position with pure terror in his eyes. He couldn't be older than 12, so I tried to put on a friendly facade for the kid. Don't worry, you're going to be freed. Just wait right here and my twin will take you to someplace safer. Just as I was to leave this room for the next one, I stopped when I heard the boy speak to me. I prayed to the gods for help. Are you an angel? No, I answered, I'm something much more. Then, I left the room and continued on to the next one. Just like before, I broke down the door, killed a woman in the room that was about to force herself onto a girl, then told her to wait for my copy. This process was repeated over and over again. Sometimes it was a man, sometimes a woman that I killed. They all shared the same wealthy status which the first man I killed exuded. A high-class sex den, yet even with rich clientele attending this establishment, they were nothing more than animals. And rabid animals should be put down. Lubelina. On the top floor of the sex den called the Golden Queen, a name given to the establishment in mockery of Princess Rena and her title of the Golden Princesses, was a section of the building that was kept off-limits to the general public. To ensure this, a heavy oaken door stood at the top of the stairs leading up to this section of the building. Heavy enchanted steel locks reinforced this door against most curious visitors of the establishment. Behind this door, 2 large men clad in steel plate mail acted as the second line of defense with the orders to capture or kill any who broke past the door. These 2 men, while not the smartest, were monstrously strong with a knack for sadism. On most days when they were unable to act upon these desires against intruders, they'd instead take their pent-up urges out on the sex slaves below them. Regardless, past these two was an elegantly carved desk that was stacked with sacks of coins and paperwork. This paperwork typically consisted of reports from multiple other brothels across the kingdom about the finances, dead or dying workers, and newly acquired workers. Sitting behind this desk in bored silence was a red-haired woman of androgynous beauty. To add more confusion to her gender was the well-tailored suit she wore that was designed in a masculine style. Those that knew this woman also knew to never bring up her masculine appearance. Despite the kind smile on her lips, her personality was anything but. She was a complete sadist that enjoyed watching the suffering on her victims' faces, and any that brought up her appearance were likely to be taken away and tortured slowly until they gasped their last painful breath. Lubelina, an angelic-sounding name for such a monstrous person, was reading through a report on the sex slaves of the Golden Queen that went on to describe that 2 of the slaves were currently dying of injuries caused by rough clientele, while another showed signs of too many venereal diseases to be marketable. This news disappointed the woman, as she typically preferred to have her own fun with unusable workers until they expired. Yet, she also avoided those riddled by disease in fear that she could become infected herself. Hiring a healer wasn't that difficult, especially for a woman of her power, but it did make people talk, and talk had a habit of ruining reputations. Dipping her quill in ink, Lubelina wrote the word temple besides the name of the diseased worker. The word was a code phrase which really meant that the worker would be taken out of the building and disposed of somewhere on the streets. No one would ask any questions, and the defective worker would typically die of exposure a few hours to days later. It helped that since the workers were underfed, they'd quickly starve, and the damages that they'd accrued over their short career would make them too weak to save themselves. After that, someone would eventually find another dead whore in the streets and they'd be sent to the temple in Riastais to be buried without any questions asked. Next to the names of the dying workers, the word basement was written. That meant that the dying workers would be sent to Lubelina's personal dungeon in the basement of the building where she could have some private fun with the workers until they died. They'd be kept alive long enough for replacement workers to be delivered, then Lubelina would deliver as many agonies as she could while the new workers would watch. It helped to break the spirits of the replacement workers, as well as show them what would happen if they tried to escape or cause problems. Pulling out another sheet of paper from the stack, Lubelina wrote out a requisition order for 3 more orders of livestock at her Riastais establishment. She addressed it to her associate, Coco Doll, before folding the letter up and sealing it with wax stamped with a symbol of a hand with 3 fingers. She set the letter aside for later delivery before pulling out another budget report. Just as she was about to read through it, a rapid and desperate banging was heard coming from the door. Annoyed at the unorthodox and disrespectful attempt to open the door, Lubelina nodded at one of her guards to open the door. She'd first hear what pitiful excuse the knocker of the door had. If it wasn't satisfactory, they'd be spending time in Lubelina's personal dungeon. The guard swiftly moved to the door and pulled a small metal shutter open to see who it was. Frantic speaking could be heard until it was silenced by the shutter closing. Then, the steel locks were unlocked and the door was pulled open to reveal a large, heavy-set man with tan skin and brown hair. The man was swiftly yanked into the room by the guard and stumbled forwards until he fell onto his hands and knees. At the same time, the door was rapidly shut and locked with practiced ease. "Tell me, what reason caused you to bang on my door like an oafish ogre?" the woman asked with a sickly sweet smile on her face. The friendliness of the expression was completely mitigated by her tone of voice and the venomous glare of her emerald eyes. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. It's just, there's something downstairs that's killing anyone they see. We tried to stop it, yet it just killed any guard that came near. Even worse was when I saw clients and staff trying to flee through the exits. It was like the doors and windows were just painted onto the walls," the man stated in abject terror. For a normal person, the idea of a killer running around murdering clients and staff should have made anyone terrified. Yet, All Lubelina felt was rage at the idea that someone was messing with her business and losing her money. Some idiot, for only an idiot would dare attack her business, a business owned and run by one of the Eight Fingers, and believe that they could ever make it out of this place alive and in one piece. An attack on one of her businesses was an attack on herself. And Lubelina never let anyone get away with attacking her without ending up in her dungeon or in a grave. Whoever the fuck had the balls to do so would suffer for the rest of their short and very miserable life once she caught them. "Shut your horse-in mouth up and stop sniveling like a dog, Jorge," Lubelina commanded with malice in her voice. The fear that Jorge felt for Lubelina outweighed the fear of the carnage that he saw downstairs, and it caused the man to become utterly silent. "Now, explain in as much detail as you possibly can, who the fuck is attacking my brothel? How many of them there are? And what their capabilities are?" Even as Lubelina said this, she had started pulling out her rapier from under her desk and stood from her chair. "I could only see one person, ma'am. I don't know who or what she is, but she ain't human. She's a blonde woman who's got these animal parts, tails and ears." Jorge mimed out the extremities that he named. Her tails were drenched in blood, and I saw why when she impaled Lucas on 3 of them. None of us could touch her, so I ran while Murmur and Dan fought her in order to tell you. "Fuck," the redhead remarked as she opened a drawer of her desk so that she could pull out a dusty scroll. Said scroll was enchanted with a write message spell. The version she had required a user to write down the message for a recipient, unlike the other kind of message scroll which only required voice. The reason for using the first kind of scroll was because the second was very expensive. This meant that the scroll was for emergency use only. Opening up the scroll, Lubelina hastily wrote down a message for assistance. Then, she activated the item and watched as it burned up in blue fire. Following this, she pulled out another scroll from her drawer and stored it into her pocket. Even with the cost of a message scroll, Lubelina always liked to have a backup plan. This scroll was directly meant for her boss, in case the worst came to pass. When she was finally done, the redhead looked back at her subordinates and spoke. "Horace and Check, take Jorge with you to deal with our guest. Bring her to me alive, if possible, else bring me back her head." While the 2 guards showed no signs of their opinion on the order, Jorge immediately went wide-eyed and fearful. "Please, ma'am. Don't make me go down there. I'll die if I do." As he said this, the 2 armored men approached Jorge on either side and grabbed him by the arms. "If you do, I'll certainly drink a toast in your honor at the bar. But stay here and I'll gut you like a fucking fish and make you watch as I pull your intestines out." Hearing this threat made the large man gulp in fear as the guards dragged Jorge with them to the door. Lubelina followed closely behind them until they reached the door. One of the guards unlocked the door and swiftly pulled it open. Then, the 3 men stepped through just as Lubelina shut the door behind them and locked it. Afterwards, she walked back to her desk and pulled open another drawer to reveal a fine bottle of wine and a glass. Uncorking the bottle, Lubelina took a moment to smell the wine's fragrance before pouring it into the glass. She then leaned against the desk and faced the door while her rapier stayed pointed to the floor, yet her tight grip on the handle of the sword betrayed the calm display that she conveyed. What Lubelina truly hated was the waiting. There was nothing but silence and contemplation to keep her company. Yet, as time went on, Lubelina started to grow discontent at the lack of any form of progress. Even if her guards and Jorge had died fighting against this intruder, the reinforcements from the 8 Fingers should have arrived to finish the job. The redhead shouldn't have been waiting in her office, like some common whore, for so long. Yet, here she was, sword in hand, and a quarter-finished bottle of wine that was pouring another glass. Just as she was about to raise the glass to her lips, the loud sound of splintering wood and crumpling metal screeched from her office door. Lubelina's eyes widened in surprise as her gaze fixated onto her door, and more specifically, the crimson spear-like object that had penetrated through the door. As her eyes focused, she took note that the object was covered in many sharply bristled tufts of fur that dripped blood onto the wooden floor. Then, In a serpentine fashion, the limb was pulled out of the door. The redhead was so focused upon how someone could punch a hole into the door so easily that her grip on the wine glass loosened enough to cause the object to smash into the floor, spilling crimson upon the floor. In a single moment, the woman brandished her sword at the ready as another limb stabbed through the door, punching a second hole into the door. The sword in Lubelina's hand wavered from witnessing the raw strength being displayed. With her heart pounding, the woman pulled out her message scroll and whispered, "The intruder made it past my defenses. If I don't message you again, then assume that the Golden Queen is compromised. Secondly, where the fuck are my reinforcements?" With her message concluded, she watched as the scroll was consumed in blue flames. This shouldn't be happening. Another boom roared from the doorway as a third hole was made. Some random bitch shouldn't have been able to make it past all of the defenses of the Eight Fingers third in command. Boom. The reinforcements should have arrived to help, yet they were either not here yet or they had all been killed. No. Boom. She was one of the head of the Eight Fingers. This was her property. Anyone that fucked with her property was killed on principle. Lubelina would make damn sure that when she broke this bitch, they wouldn't die by the blade of her rapier. They would be kept alive in a cell where Lubelina would take absolute pleasure from breaking the intruder until they begged for death. Boom. With one final smash, the door exploded into a cloud of smoke, sawdust, wood, and metal. Yet, even with the dust obscuring her view, Lubelina saw a pair of bestial eyes that glowed with the color of molten gold. "You must be the one in charge," a sultry voice stated with a barely contained growl. The voice echoed with power, and each word chipped away at Lubelina's shrinking confidence. "I am the owner of the establishment. One that you have thoroughly trashed and ruined." The redhead barked back in an effort to maintain some semblance of control, even if only in conversation. "Because of you, my business. Your business is slavery. Your workers are slaves. You are a thief. Yet, instead of trinkets, you steal people's time and lives." The voice interrupted while the glowing eyes narrowed. Lubelina couldn't help but grit her teeth in absolute rage at the thought of someone interrupting her. It was then that the sound of heels clicking against the wooden floor began to unnaturally echo around the room while the glowing eyes grew closer and the outline of a body could be seen through the smoke. Finally, Lubelina was able to fully see the intruder. The woman was unnaturally beautiful, yet that human beauty couldn't grab one's attention in the same way that the golden-furred ears atop her head could. And neither of both traits were as distracting as the 9 tails that snaked behind her. Each one of those 9 tails was the same golden color as her hair and ears, yet the gold turned to crimson due to a quarter of their length being drenched in blood. Jorge was right, this woman wasn't human. She wasn't an elf, she wasn't any type of race that Lubelina could put a name to. Yet, at the same time, the exoticness of this woman intrigued her. There had always been clients of her brothels that had a taste for unique services. The bitch before her could easily attract a lot of business with just her human features. But, those animal features of hers would be worth their weight in gold. A single night with her could sell for piles of gold. A dark smile grew upon Lubelina's face at the thoughts of humiliation and torture that she could put this bitch through. "Bitch, after I'm done thrashing you, I'll make sure that you won't die. Instead, you'll be broken before I work that ass of yours off in one of my brothels for the rest of your miserable life." She finished with a maniacal giggle. This quickly stopped as the sounds of monstrous laughter came from every corner of the room. Lubelina began looking around for other potential opponents, yet her attention was drawn back to the woman when she spoke once again, as that same monstrous laughter continued to grow in decibel and intensity. "You truly are filled with nothing but greed. Even now, when you should be praying to any one of your numerous gods, you instead think of money and suffering. Even worse, you dare threaten enslavement to a demigoddess." As the blonde roared out the last few words, her voice sounded as if a legion spoke with her. It was loud enough to drown out the horrid laughter that had started to give her a horrific headache. "I offer you a chance to pray to your gods, but I'll let you know now, I'm not listening." As she said this, She slowly started to walk towards Lubelina, while the horrid laughter was now screaming into her ears. It was enough that the redhead clapped her hands over her ears to at least muffle the sound, yet the attempt was in vain. Her head felt like iron hammers were being smashed upon it, and soon enough, she could only scream for the noise to stop as she fell to her knees as her rapier fell from her grasp and clanged against the floor. But it never did. The noise was ceaseless while every conscious moment was absolute agony. For one of the few times in her life, the woman prayed to any of the 4 great gods and any of the minor deities beneath them to help her. She begged until her voice was hoarse and ragged for the pain to stop. When it didn't, she offered up anything if the pain in her head was at least lessened to some degree. Are you truly willing to do anything for the pain to lessen? The voice of the woman clearly spoke out through the cacophony of laughter. She repeatedly nodded her head in agreement at the lifeline being offered to her. Then, under the agreement of, Guiche, do you swear to do whatever I ask of you with the failure of meeting these terms being death? Yes. Anything. Just make it stop. Lubelina answered in tears. Immediately upon saying this, the laughter banging through her head became quieter until only the soft sound of inhuman giggling could be heard. It was like a fly was buzzing in her ear, yet it was infinitely better than the noise before. When Lubelina finally opened her eyes, she found herself staring at the black high-heeled boots of the woman before her. She didn't dare raise her eyes any further, if only to spare herself the mistake of accidentally angering the woman before her and bringing back that dreaded laughter. Understand this, from this day forth, your life as you knew it is over. You will be taken back to my settlement. You will tell me everything about your businesses and how many other brothels you run with slavery. You will explain everything about where you got the slaves. After saying this, Lubelina heard the woman, no, the demigoddess, she said demigoddess, and the red head didn't want to incur her further wrath, snap her fingers, causing an ember to drop to the floor in front of her. The moment the ember touched the wood, a small blaze started to burn up and was quickly growing into something more. She didn't get the chance to see any more of her property burn as the world around her warped until she found herself in a dark stony room with a set of metal bars cutting her off from the hallway the room was connected to. The only light she received was from some torches outside her cell and a barred window that was too high to see anything except for the darkening sky above. The room she was in had only 2 things in it, a cot with a blanket, and a wooden bucket placed in the corner. Then, a voice echoed around her cell, I am Cassia Blanc, your eternal jailer. And this will be your new home for the foreseeable future. Once that was said, the cell was quiet once more, with only the faint sounds of inhuman giggling being heard. After everything that had happened, Lubelina laid down upon the cot and curled into a fetal position before she started sobbing. Cassia. After everything that had happened, I teleported to the shore of my settlement's lake for 2 reasons. The first was because I wanted to wash the blood off my tails, while the second, it was so that I could be alone to think. So, there I found myself standing on the lake's shore while my tail snaked through the water to wash the blood off. I could see that my efforts were working since clouds of crimson were blooming in the water. Yet, even if my tails were fully cleaned, it still couldn't shake off all the thoughts running through my mind. I had killed so many people in that sex den, and it completely terrified me. I know that this wasn't the first time that I've killed something in this world before. The corpses of the goblins and trolls on that farm could attest to it. Yet, there had always been this feeling of distance when I'd done so. It was in a similar vein of when a farmer was killing a chicken for food. That feeling in killing those demi-humans was normal, at least what I believed is normal, mainly because I was so used to killing monsters in Yggdrasil and any of the other games that I'd played over the years. Yet, when I killed those humans in that sex den, I felt nothing close to that feeling. Nothing for killing my formerly fellow man. Actually, I felt great about the massacre I performed. It was like the way a cat felt when they toyed with their food until finally killing it. This terrified me. If I had never ended up in this new world, and in this new body, would I still be feeling so joyous at all the monstrous humans that I killed, or would I be filled with guilt? I didn't have an answer for this question, and I doubted if I ever would. The sound of footsteps approaching caught my attention and quickly brought me away from the darker thoughts plaguing my mind. Looking over my shoulder, I saw my copy calmly approaching me. "Hey, boss. Thought I'd find you out here. I believe that the fact that you're my copy gives you a bit of an advantage in finding me." I retorted back, "Anything that you need to report?" My copy came over to my side and stood next to me before answering. "I've treated all the physical ailments of the people we saved. Can't say the same about psychological problems." My copy grimaced as she said that. I couldn't blame her. The things that those people must have suffered belonged in the darkest nightmares. I couldn't help but consider if it would be moral to erase their memories of all the trauma that they must have suffered. Perhaps I could give them a choice on the issue and sort it out that way. In addition, there was also the issue on what to do with all of these newcomers. No doubt, most, if not all, of the rescued would like to return to their original homes. How many of them are still awake? Just a few. About 4 or 5. The rest were either completely exhausted or so agitated that I had to use a sleep spell to calm them down. I offered those awake some food and water. God knows that they need more meat on their bones with how skinny all of them were. At the very least, the rescued would hopefully be eating. I'd seen my fair share of people who starved to death back home. It's funny, in a way, that our bodies need sustenance to survive, and when they can't get any food, then that very same body will internally eat itself to death. Abandoning my thoughts of morbid humor, I made a quick command: make sure that a lot of food and water continues going to our guests. Even if their wounds have been treated, that still won't prevent them from dying of starvation. After that, try and talk to anyone that is conscious so that we can find out where they belong. Understood. I'll see what I can uncover, but there is always the chance that we might be unable to find their homes or that they might have no place to return to. What then? I couldn't help but smirk when my copy asked this. We take in everyone, regardless of race, creed, and background. If they wish to leave, then we'll help them as much as we can. Else, we give them a home. For a copy of me, you aren't predicting my thought process like I believed you could. I teased. Not really, I just wanted to hear you say it. After all, we both seem to love hearing the sound of our own voices. She answered in kind before adding, really has to make you wonder if we're secretly narcissists who just never noticed it. I could only shrug in reply. She had a point. Looking into the water, the golden color of my fur told me that my tails were cleaned. I quickly raised them from the water and watched water rain down from them. I'll need to get back to Nina and her sister soon enough. I doubt that it's professional for a doctor to leave their patient alone for too long. You're a doctor now. Real step up from the paper pusher that you once were. Mind showing me your diploma? Don't need one. I'm like Jesus except with the power to drop fiery death at will. My copy rolled her eyes at my pretentious statement. Yeah, Jesus. The only other difference is the ears, the tails, and the large set of bowling balls on your chest coupled with the opposite genitalia, but I see your point. I giggled at the very true response. With a snap of my fingers, I cast Kitsune Illusion, and watched as my bestial features disappeared. I'll come back later tonight to strategize and deal with some tasks that need my direct attention. Try to keep our guests calm while you hold the fort down. If that's what you wish, Dr. Blanc. Do you wish for me to also retrieve your sexy doctor costume while I'm at it? I'll dress up as the nurse. I avoided answering that question so as to not provide my copy any more ammunition to use against me, or ideas. Following this, I quickly cast Teleport, and arrived back at my room in the Hero's Respite. Arriving in my room, I quickly spotted Taya sleeping in my bed while Nina sat in a chair next to her sister. Her attention was intensely focused upon the unconscious form of her sister, so much so, that she didn't even notice me as I walked over to her. The clicking of my heels against the wooden floor didn't even cause her to stir as I eventually got close enough to look over the teen's shoulder. I'm back, kiddo. With my announcement, Nina quickly stopped her silent vigil over her sister and turned to look at me. From the way her eyes were red and irritated, as well as the scent of salt I could smell of her. She'd been crying. I put a hand on her shoulder and looked down into her eyes. It's been so long since I started my quest to find Tyr. All these years of hoping. Thank you, for everything. She choked up, then did something that took me by surprise as she got out of her chair and hugged me in a tight embrace, more so than when she hugged me earlier. I slowly wrapped my arms around the girl in return. My pleasure, kiddo. I replied before we remained quiet. It took a while, but we eventually separated, which let me see Nina wiping her eyes of any loose tears. I walked away from her and pulled up a chair from my table over to where Nina was sitting before joining her. How's Tyr doing? I asked as I looked over the sleeping blonde girl. Even after healing the girl with my magic, I still was quite worried about her. She had spent years being used as a slave and, probably, was treated like an animal. That would have immense amounts of psychological effects on a person. The Tyr that was sleeping in my bed right now might not be the same girl that Nina had grown up with. She's been doing fine for now. Since you've been gone, all she's been doing is sleeping. Nina answered. Then, she sprung the question that I've been waiting to answer since I came back. What did you do while you were gone? I'm going to be fully honest with you, Nina. After I sent you and Tyr back to my room, I killed a lot of people, set all those enslaved free, and burned down the entire building. By the time I left, the place was ablaze with no sign of stopping. I answered the girl, leaving out the gruesome details. I'm not judging you for doing that, but why did you do it? 3 reasons. I replied before listing. I was angry at everything that I saw. The people inside that building were monsters that had to be put down so that no one else would suffer such horror at their hands again. And finally, those people knew who Tyr was, name and face. Killing all of them was a way to protect your sister from being hunted by those specific people. That was to say, I had no idea how far that 8 Fingers organization spanned or if they kept track of all the people that I took. The fire I started would cover up a lot of evidence, but there was always that possibility. None of this would be said to Nina. I didn't want to cause the girl panicked just after she got her sister back, but I would be keeping a close eye on Tyr, just in case. It was pleasing to see that Nina's posture slumped into a more relaxed state after I said this. To be fully honest, I was worried about how the girl would take my explanation. Instead of seeing fear, I was happy to see acceptance of my actions. In a way, it made me feel less like a monster than what I felt earlier. With everything that has happened, I'm unsure about what I should do now. I've been focused on how to find Tyr for so long, yet not that we're together again, I have no clue on what happens next. Placing a hand on Nina's shoulder, I gave the girl a reassuring smile. Things are going to change now, but that doesn't mean that you'll be going through all of this alone. I'm here for you, so are Peter, Lucrute, and Dine. After hearing this, the girl returned a smile back to me. I have no idea what I'd do without any of you. She then glanced back to the sleeping form of her sister. Even with how thin she is, there's barely enough room in my apartment to house 2 people. You won't need to worry about searching for a new place. I spoke. I can take care of that for you. Nina's head whipped to me and she looked at me with shock. Why, you've already done so much for me as it is. I couldn't possibly impose on you any further than I already have. I silenced her by raising my hand. Kiddo, you're my apprentice, and in a sense, my ward. It's my job as your teacher to make sure that you can learn and grow in a suitable environment. Standing up, I aimed my hand at a bare wall on the right of my room and cast the spell, Mage's Hidden Sanctuary. The initial effect of the spell created a new doorway against the wall that was made of marble. A doorknob made of a golden metal was the only imperfection against the rest of the smooth marble door. This was a very useful spell for high-level magic casters in Yggdrasil. It could almost be imagined as a player-made guild base, except much smaller and with a lot more inherent flaws to it. For one thing, first-time casting of the spell would drain up all of a player's mana, with no exceptions, followed by a cast time of 10 minutes. Those first 2 costs were exceptionally dangerous since it left one wide open for any to attack. Because of this, Any that actually learned and used this spell would do so in the safety of a group, a base, or far away from any civilization. Following this, the initial sanctuary that a player would create would literally be an empty cube that was 10 by 10 by 10 meters. The only way to expand this cube was by either paying in experience or gold. Since I didn't have the experience to spare due to how difficult it was to level up initially for me, I had to spend metric tons of gold to get my sanctuary expanded to 40 meters. Then, I had to actually fill up this sanctuary with materials to make it inhabitable. That was many more hours of grinding to collect the materials to fill up my sanctuary. After all that work, I had finally made a nice little base to store my things. At least until I gained access to a secret place that was much more secure to store my valuables. I still needed to test and see if I still had access to that place as it stored, above all, my third world item. It would be a damn shame if I couldn't get there, since that final world item was probably the most useful out of all the items I had attained. Back on topic, there were inherent weaknesses to this spell that made it unpopular if you didn't prepare for it. The doorway to the sanctuary was fixed to where you summoned it, and would remain in the summoned location for a month before it could be moved. If you entered the sanctuary through it, then that meant that you could only exit the pocket realm through that same spot. So, if a group of players knew that you were inside, they could just camp the doorway until you finally came out. Another weakness to this spell was that others could follow you inside the sanctuary, invited or otherwise. So, if a player managed to quickly teleport inside before you closed the door, you'd be pretty fucked. The final weakness to this spell was that anyone could open the door if they were inside the sanctuary. This meant if said player teleported inside your realm and stole items from it, they could run off giggling like an asshole if you didn't protect the exit. Typically, whenever I casted this spell, I would cast a massive amount of traps around the location before using creation to bury myself and the doorway in a hidden underground chamber away from prying eyes. My reason for casting it in this room without any of said preparations beforehand was simple: the room that Nina and I are in has already been warded with as many defenses as I thought that I could get away with. Also, from what I've seen for the past few days since arriving here, the typical ability level of beings in this new world were hilariously outclassed by mine. "Come with me for a few moments," I told Nina as I uncrossed my legs and stood up from my chair. Nina, as a dutiful apprentice, followed me to the new doorway. An upside to no longer needing a menu to use my spells was that I didn't need to waste time typing out a name to give Nina permission to open the door to my sanctuary. Turning the doorknob, I pushed the door of my sanctuary open to reveal the entrance. Inside, the first sight one would see would be a large garden filled with plants that grew alchemical ingredients. It had taken some time to acquire all the ingredients, but my garden had as many of the ingredients from Yggdrasil that I could fit. Unlike most sanctuaries, mine was built from the top downwards. I had 8 floors in this realm. The top 7 floors were 4 meters high. The 8th floor was 12 meters high due to the things being produced there needing room. The garden filled almost the entire floor besides a simple cabin in the center, 8 by 8 meters, that was made of mahogany. Each side of this building had walls of windows that gave a pleasant view of the garden, while a small stone pathway led to the front door. "Come inside." I then entered the sanctuary and started walking to the cabin. "What is this?" Nina asked as she entered. "It's a pocket dimension that I created as one of my many secret bases. I generally treat it as a place to store stuff in." While walking through the garden, I took note that unlike other times I've come here, this time my nose took in the myriad of fragrances coming from the plants around me. It was certainly better than smelling the stench of the city. If you've been able to conjure a place like this, and I have no idea how you even went about making a place like this, how come you've been living in the Hero's Respite instead of in here? Nina pondered as she looked around the sanctuary in wonder. "I live in the Hero's Respite because it's a physical address that people can find me at. In addition, continuous living inside of this sanctuary is risky since I have no knowledge of any events that occur outside of this space." Answering this, I reached the front door of the cabin and opened it before entering. Inside, on the left of the cabin, An alchemy table sat in a corner with a chest next to it that held all the alchemy supplies that I collected from the garden. Against the wall opposite that, a bookshelf stood with some cushioned chairs surrounding a table in front of it. The rest of the room contained basic amenities like an oven, cabinets, and other odds and ends. At the back of the cabin, a closed hatch in the floor lead to the rest of the sanctuary. All in all, there was plenty of room for a few people to live inside comfortably on just the first floor. You think that this could fit Tyre and you? I asked as the teen came into the cabin and started looking around in wonder. This definitely could. She then looked at me and asked, "Are you really letting Tyre and I live here? It would be odd if I showed you this place for no reason except to show off. You and your sister are fully welcome to live in this place. I'm not really using it for anything but to collect dust and junk," I replied and watched the pure joy radiate off Ninia's face. "Thank you. I don't know how Tyre or I could ever repay you for this. I'll make sure that this place is taken care of." I simply patted the girl on the head. "You don't need to repay me. You needed help, and I had the power to do so." With a wave of my hand, I cast Create Greater Item to make a set of beds that took up a corner of the room. "I'll give you a full tour of this place after Tyre wakes up. If you wish, you can stay in my room or in this realm tonight. I'll stay in your room tonight, if that's fine with you. I want to be there when Tyre finally wakes up." I gave her a nod of acceptance. "Good, because that allows me to do some tasks tonight without worrying about leaving your sister alone." When I said this, Ninia gave me a question look. "I need to take care of some things that have come up. I'll be back before you even wake up in the morning," I answered. "Is it because of Tyre and I?" I shook my head. While she was partially right that finding Tyre was what led me to find all those documents in that brothel, none of this was Ninia or Tyre's fault. Regardless, I kept the rest of this information from Ninia since I didn't want her to worry. The only one she needed to worry about was her sister. "Now, let's go get some food. You're probably starving after everything that has happened today. I know that I am." About an hour later, I finally left the hero's respite and teleported back to the settlement, and more specifically, to the small cabin that looked over the rest of the lake. When I entered the building, I spotted my copy waiting for me in a chair next to a table that had multiple documents spread over it. "Hey, boss. I hope you didn't mind, but I started to already organize all the documents that you collected from the sex den," she stated, much to my thankful relief that it wouldn't be such a tedious task for me. I quickly grabbed a chair and pulled it up to the table before joining her in looking over all the documentation. "How have our guests been since I've been gone?" I asked her as I looked over some documents that were related to finances. "Around half of them woke up sometime after you left and ate the food that was provided. I was highly careful on who entered or exited the hospital since I was unsure on how they felt about our other non-human inhabitants. I was able to get responses from 7 of our guests about who they were and where they came from." She then gave me a sly grin. "In addition, a young boy seemed to have quite the hero worship of you when he saw me. He's of the belief that you are a divine or magical being from a fairy tale sent to rescue everyone. You wouldn't have happened to have done or said anything to them to influence this?" Recalling the people that I saved, the memory of that one boy who thought that I was an angel came to mind. "I think I know who you're talking about. A kid I rescued thought I was an angel sent to rescue him. I told him otherwise," I answered. "Sounds like fun. I'm just letting you know ahead of time so that you don't end up surprised if a religion based around you pops up with people worshipping the very earth you tread." I tried to shrug off my copy's remark, but it did make me wonder what my future would look like. When interacting with the Green Claw tribe, I hadn't exactly dissuaded them from their belief that I was a deity. And my interactions with the inhabitants of the settlement weren't pushing against that idea. If they want to worship me, they can. I won't stop anyone here from doing what they want as long as it isn't harming anyone else," I answered before focusing my attention back onto the documents. The first one that I picked up and began reading was a letter from someone called Cocodole. What kind of stupid name was that? Had to be a code name or something. Either way, from the contents of the letter, it seemed that my prisoner was getting more slaves transferred to her establishments. Though, the letter didn't refer to the people as slaves, instead they were called cattle. If I didn't know of what they were actually doing, I might easily have assumed that this wasn't code for shipping animals instead of people. Dealing with this criminal organization is going to be horribly tedious, I can already tell. Back in my world, criminal organizations in my country had become so deeply ingrained into everyday life that it was like kicking an anthill. Bring down one group and another would take its place. From the amount of documentation that was just on this table, it was easy enough to tell that this group was large. There was only one way to deal with a large operation like this, and that would entail destroying all methods of production before they had any time to react. It was similar to the time that I had to fight against a guild that I managed to piss off. Specifically, the guild who I stole a world item from. They were beyond pissed when I lured the holder of the item into a trap by pretending to have run out of mana. Since Daughter of Inori was such a rare class, no one really knew about it or its abilities. And, considering that there was normally no mana regeneration in the game, I exploited the hell out of everyone's lack of knowledge. So, when I fought the holder of the world item, I pretended to run out of mana mid-battle, letting my opponent become overconfident. When it looked like I had no true options for escape, they tried to kill me with an overcharged spell. Really freaked that guy out when their supposedly manaless opponent suddenly used counterspell to cause their spell to whiff. I executed him quickly afterwards and gained the world item, Tome of the First Mage. After that, their entire guild declared all-out war on me. What I found very amusing about that supposed war was the fact that they expected me to fight openly as one person against their many. Instead, I fought tactically. If they were away from any of their production sources, I'd nuke them into oblivion. Anyone that went off on their own would be coming back to their guild with a lighter inventory and fewer levels. It didn't take long for me to make a guild of 32 people become paranoid wrecks that were too afraid to leave their base for fear that I'd murder them. After an entire month of this, their guild finally surrendered since they had lost too many resources to remain a competitive faction. After the news of my victory came out, people learned to not fuck with me. Sadly, I gained a reputation that made me more well-known, as well as a more tempting target to kill. Either way, I'll need to probe my prisoner for more information on this Cocodole and his slave operation. Knowing what I need to deal with will be extremely helpful in taking these assholes down. But that'll be a job to do later. Right now, I have to read through all these pages first if I'm to get an overall layout of these people. By the way, how was Zarasu doing today? Is he adjusting well? I asked. Tall, dark, and scaly was acclimating to the village very well. He was fairly interested in meeting and talking to the inhabitants and creating initial plans for a new fishery here. Though, he did come by to the building where we're housing our guests. I had him help deliver food. I gave my copy a raised eyebrow. It's rude to make a diplomatic visitor work when it wasn't his problem in the first place, I stated before going back to reading. He wasn't opposed to helping out. And besides, if we're to be welcoming more citizens to our village, it's only appropriate to include them in our activities. Try to relax a bit. You shouldn't stay so stressed all the time or you'll get wrinkles. I couldn't help but snort at my copy's remark. I highly doubt that my race is even able to get wrinkles. Don't the stories usually say that kitsune are immortal? And even if that's not the case, I'm a demigoddess, which I'm pretty sure means that I'll not be getting old anytime soon, especially with how I could interpret the way my passives might work in a real setting. My copy mockingly clapped in reply. You know, you're just insufferable with how haughty you can be. You can probably fix that in your bedroom in an hour by yourself or with someone else. I'll let you know, we have plenty of stamina and a hair trig. Can we please not talk about that right now? I replied with a massive blush on my face, causing my copy to grin in excited interest. I'm sad to say that I've been tempted to explore this body, but I've been nervous about doing so. Why not? We're the same person, So who better to talk about your private thoughts with? I know for a fact that you were checking out a few of the males at the guild earlier today. Technically, you're a virgin in this body, so why not lose it already? Because it's already weird enough that I'm attracted to guys when I wasn't before. Having sex as another gender is the furthest thing in my mind right now, I said, probably a little loud for this cabin. My copy rolled her eyes at my display, which made me wonder, was she a different person or just me without any of my inhibitions? Following my outburst, my copy got out of her chair and walked over to me before standing next to me. That's enough of that, boss. I'll not let you work while you're like this, so find a room and work off all that pent-up energy of yours or go to bed. I'll take care of everything here. Looking at her from the corner of my eyes, I couldn't help but give her a glare. I'm supposed to be the one in charge here, so why was my copy trying to order me around? What's to stop me from unsummoning you and going back to work? I asked. Well, the fact that there's a lot of things that I know right now about events that have occurred in the settlement which you don't. Along with that, I could continue remaining insubordinate if you were to summon me again. Fuck, she had me there. Aren't you supposed to follow my orders instead of give them? I asked as I leaned back into my chair and looked up at the busty clone standing over me. Typically, I do follow your orders, but I also have enough free will to make my own decisions when they are required, including ignoring orders if I feel that they are going against your well-being. Now, go to your room, and take it easy. I'll see you after you're either done or in the morning. With a sigh, I flipped my copy the bird and got out of my chair. I hate you so much right now, I said before going to my cabin's bedroom. Before I actually entered the room, I leaned my head back through the doorway and added, make sure to take notes of anything important. My copy simply waved me off with a laugh and answered, way ahead of you. See you later, boss. What a bitch. With a sigh, I entered into the bedroom of my cabin and shut the door behind me. Then, I walked over to my bed and laid down on it, just looking at the ceiling. The copy. Suffice to say, I think I'm relatively decent at talking myself into doing things. Now, normally I'm all for letting Kasha the boss order me around. It's part of my purpose after all. Gotta take care of the original. Part of this was due to the way that she was so snappy with me. Typically, she takes my jabs with ease, yet this wasn't so today. It was easy enough to tell when I got summoned by the boss earlier today that she was a bit off. Even if she does well in hiding it, the fact that she cannot return home along with being in a body that she wasn't born with was getting to her. The horrors she saw in that brothel today along with the extermination that she performed of those monstrous humans didn't help matters. Even now, she still wasn't able to fully accept her new body and mind, which is causing her immense distress. I am probably the only one in this world that understands how she's feeling right now, yet even so, it was incredibly easy to accept my mind and form. In part, being a temporary clone came with the benefit of being extremely comfortable in accepting my situation. When one really thinks about it, my situation would give any normal person an existential crisis. But, oddly enough, I felt strangely fulfilled with my life. Quite possibly an after effect of the magic used to create me. But that is a debate for another day. Right now, I needed to read through these documents in order to gather information for the boss. Following this, I hurried back to reading through everything and jotting down names and places. This went undisturbed for a few minutes before my ears picked up a strange moaning from the other room. I couldn't help smiling in amusement before I went back to the task at hand. When I'm finished with this, and if Kasha didn't come back from her room, I'm totally going to fuck with the boss in the morning. I'm wondering, sexy nurse or sexy doctor?